There is a peculiar kind of silence that lives between intention and action. The kind that settles in your chest when you've recorded something honest, something real, and then find yourself staring at the upload button as if it were a threshold into judgment itself. Some people create constantly. Their folders overflow with videos, takes almost perfects. They know the angle of morning light through their window. They've memorized the exact breath before speaking. They've edited their pauses until the rhythm feels true, but the world never sees them. Their camera roll holds evidence of effort. Their profile remains a ghost town of possibility. And perhaps they tell themselves a comfortable story, that the timing isn't right, that the content needs refinement, that tomorrow or next week or when the algorithm favors them, they'll finally press publish. But beneath these rational explanations lives a deeper truth they rarely name aloud. They're terrified, not of failure exactly, but of something more primal, of being witnessed, of offering themselves to a world that might look away, or worse, look too closely and find them wanting. This is not laziness. This is not perfectionism masquerading as procrastivity. This is something older, something that speaks to how we learn what's safe and what's dangerous when it comes to being seen. Because visibility has become the currency of existence in the modern age. To be is to be perceived. To matter is to be watched. Yet some people stand at the edge of that exchange and cannot bring themselves to participate, not because they have nothing to say, but because saying it might confirm their oldest fear, that their voice when finally released into the world will dissolve into irrelevance. There's a loneliness in this that others rarely understand. To create but not share. To have prepared your offering but kept it locked away. You watch others post casually, carelessly, and wonder what permission they possess that you lack. What confidence allows them to risk judgment without paralysis? And slowly, quietly, you begin to believe something painful. That perhaps the problem isn't the content. Perhaps the problem is you. That you're fundamentally unsuited for visibility. That staying hidden isn't a choice but a destiny written into your nature long before you ever held a camera. But what if that story, the one you've been telling yourself, is incomplete? What if your silence isn't weakness, but a response to something that happened before you could name it? What if understanding why you don't post is more important than forcing yourself to post before you're ready? You recognize the pattern even if you've never named it aloud. The ritual begins with inspiration. An idea arrives like grace, urgent and clear. You feel the possibility of it, the shape of what you might say, so you prepare. You angle the camera. You rehearse the opening line until it sounds natural, unrehearsed. You press record and something happens. For 3 minutes, maybe 5, you inhabit a version of yourself that feels true, articulate, present, real. Then you watch it back, and the criticism begins. Your voice sounds wrong, slightly off from how it lives inside your head. The lighting exposes imperfections you hadn't noticed in the mirror. That pause you thought was thoughtful now feels awkward, uncertain. The confidence you felt while filming dissolves frame by frame. So you delete. You tell yourself you'll try again tomorrow, when you're more prepared, more yourself. Except tomorrow you discover the same flaws, the same gap between vision and execution. The folder grows. Draft after draft accumulating like evidence of effort that will never be witnessed. Sometimes you make it further. You edit. You polish. You even export the file. You open the app, begin typing a caption, then stop. Because suddenly the weight of it becomes unbearable. Once you post, it exists independent of you. It will be judged by strangers, misunderstood by friends. Compared to others who seem effortlessly authentic, you imagine the notifications, or worse, the absence of them. The video sitting there, proof of your attempt, gathering dust in the algorithm's indifference. So, you save it as a draft. Tell yourself you'll publish it later when conditions are more favorable, when you feel ready. But ready never arrives. It's always just beyond the next revision, the next perfect moment. Meanwhile, you scroll. You watch others post casually, carelessly, without the paralysis that grips you. They make mistakes and laugh about them. They share raw thoughts, without 3 days of deliberation. They seem to possess some fundamental permission you lack, some immunity to judgment. And you wonder what happened to you that didn't happen to them. What broke inside you that makes visibility feel like violence. You study their confidence, trying to reverse engineer it, hoping to extract the formula that might finally free you. But all you learn is that your hesitation runs deeper than technique. It's not about better lighting or smoother delivery. It's about believing you deserve to take up space in a world that already feels too crowded, too loud, too full of people who seem more certain than you could ever be. You develop sophisticated rationalizations. You're still learning. You're waiting for your voice to mature. You want your first post to represent you properly. These aren't lies exactly. They're protective stories, narratives that let you maintain dignity in your retreat. Because admitting the truth feels too vulnerable, that you're afraid, that you've recorded yourself saying true things and then hidden them away because truth, when spoken aloud, becomes accountable, subject to interpretation, vulnerable to dismissal. And perhaps some part of you has learned that it's safer to imagine being seen than to actually be seen. Safer to preserve the potential of your voice than to test it against reality. So you become a ghost in your own digital life, present but invisible, creating but never sharing. You cheer for others, leave thoughtful comments, engage from the shadows. You're generous with everyone except yourself. And slowly, quietly, this becomes your identity. The person who almost posts, the person with hidden potential, the observer who never quite steps into the light. It feels noble sometimes, this restraint, like you're resisting the shallow performance of modern life. Like your silence is a form of integrity. But late at night when you're alone with your thoughts, you know it's something else. It's fear wearing the mask of wisdom. It's protection masquerading as principle. It's the careful construction of a life where you never have to discover whether your voice, when finally released, would matter to anyone at all. Here is what's happening beneath the surface in the territory your conscious mind rarely visits. Psychologists have a name for this pattern. They call it self-protective inhibition. It's the brain's ancient mechanism for avoiding danger, except the danger isn't physical anymore. It's emotional. It's the threat of being witnessed and found insufficient, of offering your authentic self and watching it be met with indifference, or worse, with judgment that confirms your deepest suspicions about your own inadequacy. So your nervous system does what it's designed to do. It protects you. It keeps you safe by keeping you hidden. And what feels like failure is actually an intricate defense system working exactly as intended. But defense systems have origins. They don't emerge from nowhere. For many people, this pattern began long before they ever held a camera. Perhaps there was a moment in childhood when vulnerability met punishment, when you shared something true and someone laughed, when you expressed excitement and a parent said, "Don't get your hopes up," when you tried something new and the mockery lingered longer than the attempt. These moments might seem small, forgettable, but the nervous system doesn't forget. It catalogs, it learns. It constructs rules from wounds. And one of those rules becomes this: visibility equals risk. Authenticity invites pain. Safety lives in silence. This is why your resistance to posting isn't about laziness or procrastination. It's trauma response masquerading as perfectionism. Because perfectionism isn't actually about excellence. It's about control. It's the belief that if you can just make something flawless enough, you can prevent rejection. If you polish every edge, rehearse every word, eliminate every imperfection, maybe then you'll be safe. Maybe then you'll be worthy of being seen. Except perfectionism is an impossible standard designed to protect you from trying, because nothing can ever be perfect enough to guarantee acceptance. So the standard keeps rising, and your videos keep accumulating in folders, and you remain protected from the very thing you claim to want. Psychologists recognize this pattern in what they call impostor syndrome, though that term doesn't quite capture the full architecture of the fear. It's not just that you feel like a fraud. It's that you've constructed your entire self-concept around the belief that your worth is conditional, earned, revocable. That you exist on probation, constantly awaiting the moment when others discover you don't deserve the space you occupy. So posting becomes terrifying not because of what might happen, but because of what might be revealed. That you're ordinary, that your thoughts aren't as profound as they feel inside your head, that the gap between who you believe you are and who you actually are is wider than you can bear to acknowledge. And underneath all these layers, beneath the perfectionism and the shame and the fear of evaluation, lies one fundamental question. The question that governs everything. The question you've been asking since you first learned that love could be conditional and presence could be withdrawn. The question is simple and devastating. If I show the real me, will anyone stay? Because that's what this is really about. Not posting, not visibility, but belonging. The primal human need to be known and still be wanted. To be seen in your imperfection and not be abandoned. You learned somewhere along the way that authenticity is dangerous, that the real you, unfiltered and unpolished, might not be enough. So you developed strategies. You learned to perform acceptability instead of risking authenticity. You learned to edit yourself before anyone else could. You learned that the safest version of yourself is the one that never fully appears. This is the hidden psychology of hesitation, not weakness, not character flaw, but a sophisticated survival mechanism built from experiences that taught you the world isn't always safe for vulnerability. Your silence isn't the problem. Your silence is the solution your nervous system created to a problem it perceived long ago. The question isn't why you don't post. The question is, what did posting come to represent that made it feel so dangerous? What old wound are you still protecting? What ancient rejection are you still trying to prevent? But here is where the story becomes more complex, more layered. Because perhaps your resistance to posting is not entirely pathological. Perhaps some part of you, the part that remains unbroken by conditioning, recognizes something true about the modern architecture of visibility. That what we call connection has become performance. That what we call sharing has become marketing. That the self, when constantly documented, stops being discovered and starts being manufactured. And maybe, just maybe, your silence is not only protection, maybe it's also wisdom. There is something sacred about the unseen. The unwitnessed moment holds a quality that evaporates the instant it's captured for consumption. You feel this intuitively, even if you've never articulated it. When you film something beautiful and never post it, that beauty remains yours, uncommodified, unmonetized, free from the transactional logic that governs digital exchange. In a culture that insists everything must be shared to be real, not posting becomes an act of rebellion. A quiet declaration that your experience doesn't require external validation to matter, that you can exist fully without an audience. That meaning isn't measured in metrics. This is the paradox you've been living inside without recognizing it. The same mechanism that protects you from judgment also protects you from reduction, from being flattened into content, from having your complexity compressed into consumable fragments. Because social media doesn't want your truth, it wants your performance of truth. It wants the polished, packaged version that can be liked and shared and algorithmically distributed. But you sense somewhere deep in your being that this transaction costs something essential, that every time you edit yourself for palatability, you lose proximity to whatever is real inside you. Carl Jung wrote something that echoes across decades into this exact moment of your life. He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." And perhaps this is your work now. Not to force yourself into visibility before you understand why visibility feels like violence, but to examine the unconscious forces that keep you hidden. To distinguish between the fear that protects you from genuine danger and the fear that protects you from growth. To ask yourself honestly, is my silence serving me, or has it become a prison I've mistaken for sanctuary? Because the truth, the uncomfortable truth, is that both things can be real simultaneously. You can be protecting yourself from a system that objectifies and commodifies, and you can be protecting yourself from the vulnerability required for genuine connection. You can be resisting shallow performance, and you can be avoiding authentic expression. The line between wisdom and wound is often invisible until you're willing to examine it without judgment. Until you're willing to sit with the possibility that your silence, however noble it feels, might also be keeping you from something you need. Not visibility for its own sake, but the freedom to choose visibility without terror. The ability to be seen and remain intact. The knowledge that you can offer yourself to the world and survive the offering. What if your silence isn't destiny? What if it's just a story you've been telling so long it feels like truth? What if the point isn't to post everything, to perform constantly, to chase validation, but to understand why you don't? To make the unconscious conscious. To see clearly which fears serve you and which ones simply keep you small. Because behind every withheld video lives a person still negotiating with an old belief, still deciding whether the world deserves their voice, still learning whether they deserve to use it. Let me tell you what happens when protection becomes identity. When the strategy you develop to survive judgment becomes the architecture of your adult life, you become someone who perfects instead of participates, who plans endlessly but rarely finishes, who lives perpetually in preparation for a moment that never arrives because the conditions for readiness keep shifting, always just beyond reach. This is not failure of discipline. This is the natural consequence of a nervous system trained to associate visibility with danger. And over time, over years of rehearsing, without performing, something calcifies inside you. You might find yourself watching life from the margins, always observing, rarely entering. You become the person who cheers loudest for others while doubting your own worth, who celebrates their friends' courage while calling your own hesitation wisdom, who has opinions, insights, perspectives that could matter, yet keeps them locked away where they remain theoretical, untested, safe. Because mastery without vulnerability is not mastery. It's avoidance wearing the costume of competence. You chase perfection not for growth, but for protection. Not to become excellent, but to become immune to criticism. And the irony, the painful irony, is that this very strategy ensures you never discover what you're actually capable of. See, there's a particular loneliness that emerges from this pattern. It's not the loneliness of being alone. It's the loneliness of being unknown, of carrying thoughts and feelings and truths that never reach another consciousness. You might have relationships, friendships, connections, but something essential remains hidden. The parts of you that feel too raw, too real, too vulnerable to risk in the light. You learn to perform a version of yourself that's acceptable, manageable, safe. But that performance, however skillful, creates distance. Because intimacy requires the very thing you've learned to withhold. The unedited self, the imperfect truth, the voice that trembles when it speaks. And perhaps you've convinced yourself you don't care about posting, about sharing, about visibility. You tell yourself you're above such shallow pursuits, that you're protecting your authenticity from commodification, that your silence is integrity. But late at night, when you're alone with the version of yourself that can't be fooled, you know there's another story underneath. You care deeply, too deeply. So deeply that the possibility of your voice dissolving into indifference feels unbearable. So you protect yourself the only way you know how, by never fully trying, by keeping your truth theoretical, by maintaining the comfort of potential without the risk of actualization. These are not personality flaws. These are survival strategies. You learned early that safety lives in invisibility, that being seen could mean being hurt, that the cost of authenticity might be rejection. So, you developed sophisticated mechanisms to stay protected. You became thoughtful instead of spontaneous, careful instead of courageous. You learn to live in your head where everything remains controllable, where you can edit and revise and perfect without consequence. But the cost that accumulates so quietly you barely notice until it's everywhere, is this: you become estranged from your own aliveness. From the part of you that wants to be witness to matter, to leave some mark proving you existed here. Because isolation, when maintained long enough, stops feeling like choice. It starts feeling like nature. Like this is simply who you are, the quiet one, the careful one, the one who watches life happen to other people. And the tragedy is not that you're broken. The tragedy is that you're not. You're simply responding rationally to what you learned about the danger of being known. But rational responses to old wounds can become prisons when the threat has passed and you've forgotten you hold the key. So, let me tell you something about healing that contradicts almost everything you've been taught. Healing doesn't mean forcing yourself to post. It doesn't mean conquering your fear through sheer exposure. It doesn't mean becoming someone who shares carelessly, casually, without the weight you've always carried. Healing means something quieter, something more fundamental. It means learning that you are safe, whether or not you're approved of, that your worth exists independent of witness, that you can be seen and remain whole. This begins not with action, but with recognition. With turning toward the part of yourself that's been protecting you all these years and saying something radical: thank you. Thank you for keeping me safe when safety felt impossible. Thank you for building walls when the world felt dangerous. Thank you for perfecting when perfection felt like the only path to acceptance. Because that fear, that hesitation, that elaborate defense system, it wasn't your enemy. It was your attempt at survival, and it worked. You're still here, still breathing, still carrying truths that matter, even if they've remained unspoken. But survival strategies have expiration dates. What protected you at 15 might imprison you at 30. What kept you safe in one context might keep you small in another. And the work now, the tender, difficult work, is learning to distinguish between real danger and remembered danger. between the fear that warns you of genuine threat and the fear that simply echoes old wounds. This requires something most people avoid. It requires sitting with yourself without judgment, watching your old drafts not to critique but to witness, to see the person who tried, who felt something true and attempted to give it shape, who cared enough to record even if they couldn't yet share. You don't heal by becoming fearless. You heal by becoming honest, by naming what's actually happening beneath your resistance, by saying aloud, even if only to yourself, I'm afraid. I'm afraid my voice doesn't matter. I'm afraid of being misunderstood. I'm afraid of confirmation that I'm ordinary. And then, after naming it, after letting that truth breathe in the light, you say something else, something gentler, and I'm allowed to try anyway. Because here's what no one tells you about healing. It doesn't happen in grand gestures. It happens in small permissions. In posting something imperfect and surviving it, in speaking before you're ready and discovering you remain intact, in being witnessed in your vulnerability and not dissolving. Each small act becomes evidence against your oldest fear. Each imperfect offering teaches your nervous system something revolutionary, that visibility doesn't equal annihilation. That judgment doesn't erase you. That you can be seen, be criticized, be ignored, be misunderstood, and still wake up tomorrow whole. You don't owe the internet a performance. You don't owe anyone your story. But you do owe yourself something. You owe yourself the freedom to choose visibility without terror, the ability to share without needing validation, the knowledge that your voice, imperfect and uncertain as it might sound, has a right to exist in the world, not because it will change everything, but because it's yours. And you've kept it locked away long enough. Maybe your next upload won't be perfect. Maybe it will feel vulnerable and awkward and too revealing. Maybe 12 people will see it and 11 will scroll past. And maybe that's exactly how it should be, because healing isn't about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more fully yourself, about integrating the parts you've kept hidden, about learning that wholeness includes the messy, imperfect, still learning pieces you've been editing out. Some people post, some people pause. Both are negotiating the same fundamental question: how do I exist in a world that confuses visibility with value? And perhaps there's no single answer. Perhaps the point was never to choose between silence and speech. Perhaps the point was always to understand why you chose what you chose, to make the unconscious conscious, to see clearly what you've been protecting and whether that protection still serves the person you're becoming. If you've ever filmed something true and kept it hidden, know this: your silence doesn't mean you failed. It means you're still learning to trust your own voice, still discovering whether the world is safe enough for what you carry, still negotiating between the need to be known and the fear of being reduced. And that negotiation, however painful, is not weakness. It's the work of becoming whole, of integrating the parts of yourself that have lived in exile, of learning that you can be both vulnerable and intact, both seen and safe. Maybe one day you'll post. Maybe you'll press publish and discover that the terror you imagined was larger than the reality. Maybe you'll find that some people understand, some people don't, and you survive both. Or maybe you won't post. Maybe you'll continue creating for yourself, honoring the sacred space of the unwitnessed. Either way, either choice, you remain whole. Because the art already exists. It exists in your camera roll, in your draft folder, in your consciousness. It exists because you do. And perhaps that's the final truth worth holding. Silence isn't hiding. It's simply the space where voice prepares itself. The darkness before dawn, the breath before speech. You've been holding that breath for so long. And whenever you're ready, whenever the moment arrives that feels true, you're allowed to exhale.